Welcome to the training presentation for Standard 3 version 2.1. This is an accreditation standard and it applies to certification bodies. It is also relevant for the accreditation body, which uses the accreditation criteria in its oversight process. This module is mandatory for certification bodies, the accreditation body, and peer reviewers. It is optional for certificate holders, although they will benefit from understanding what to expect during certification evaluations. In this session, we will give you a detailed overview of Standard 3, its purpose, and its contents. We will work through all 15 sections and Annex 1. Along the way, we will focus on the indicators that have been revised or added in version 2.1, because those are the areas where you will need to adjust your procedures. The transition period for version 2.1 runs from the 29th of July 2026 to the 28th of October 2027. During this period, evaluations conducted against version 2.0 remain valid, but in order to use v2.1 standards, the certification body shall formally get its SBP accreditation updated to cover Standard 3 v2.1. Let's dive in. SBP has designed a certification scheme that relies on a third-party independent certification process carried out by accredited certification bodies. SBP Standard 3 sets out the requirements that certification bodies must follow when assessing the conformity and compliance of organizations against the SBP standards. These requirements are additional to the requirements of ISO 17065 and 14065 if applicable. SBP Standard 3 defines the requirements to be followed during the key stages of the certification process, including preparing and conducting evaluations, evaluation compliance, handling non-conformances, certification decisions, issuing and managing certificates, etc. Before we dive into the detail of Standard 3, it helps to remind ourselves where it sits in the SBP scheme. SBP has 6 standards. Standards 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 apply to certificate holders, the companies producing, trading, or using biomass. Standard 3 is different. Standard 3 applies to the certification bodies themselves. It sets out how they must be accredited, how they select and qualify their auditors, how they plan and conduct evaluations, how they report, and how they make certification decisions. Sitting above the certification bodies is the accreditation body, which uses Standard 3 as the basis for its oversight of the certification bodies. Everything we discuss in the next slides flows from that structure. Version 2.1 is not a rewrite of Standard 3. It is a targeted refinement, which changes grouping into 8 themes. First, ISO 14065 accreditation is now required if a certification body conducts Standard 6 audits and the geographical scope of accreditation has been clarified to be linked to chain of custody accreditations. Second, the qualification requirements for the quality reviewer are clarified across indicators 4.2, 4.3, 4.6, 4.7, and 4.8. Third, chain of custody auditor qualification is now sufficient for certain low-risk evaluations under indicator 4.1, reducing administrative burden. Fourth, a new indicator 6.5 makes the classification of end users explicit, ensuring they are always evaluated on-site. Fifth, indicator 6.23 introduces provisions for sampling when auditing risk mitigation measures, along with additional flexibility. Sixth, the triggers for peer review are redefined under indicator 10.1. Seventh, revised timelines and conditions for major corrective action requests and certification decisions relax the deadline from 1 month to 3 months, aligned with the 90-day reporting window under indicators 8.9, 8.15, and 11.6. 8. A new safety valve under indicator 12.13 allows certificate validity to be extended by up to 6 months in exceptional circumstances, and a new indicator 14.5 links trademark license agreement suspension to certificate status. We will cover each of these in detail as we go. Let's start with Section 1, which covers the eligibility requirements for certification bodies. This section is primarily relevant for CB program managers, those responsible for ensuring their organization meets the requirements to offer SBP certification services. It's less directly relevant if you're an auditor, but still useful context. 4 indicators have been revised in version 2.1. Let's walk through each one. Indicator 1.1.1, certification bodies must hold SBP accreditation in line with ISO 17065. That hasn't changed. What's new is that if your CB conducts audits under Standard 6, which deals with energy and carbon balance calculations, you must also hold ISO 14065 accreditation. This brings SBP into line with the wider regulatory approach to greenhouse gas verification. If your CB does not currently hold ISO 14065 and plans to offer Standard 6 audits, you'll need to address this during the transition period. Indicator 1.1.2. The accreditation scope structure is now set out more explicitly. A CB must hold accreditation for Standards 4 and 5. Accreditation for Standards 1, 2, and 6 remains optional. The CB chooses which of those it wants to cover. This is really a clarity improvement rather than a substantive change. Indicator 1.1.5. Previously, only FSC and PEFC were recognized as proxy accreditations. Version 2.1 adds SFI to that list. The forest management or chain of custody scope of the CB's FSC, PEFC, or SFI accreditation must still be equivalent to the SBP accreditation scope. And finally, indicator 1.1.7. This indicator used to be ambiguous about whether geographical scope was tied to forest management or chain of custody accreditation. Version 2.1 resolves that. The geographical scope of the SBP accreditation must now match the geographical scope of the CB's FSC, PEFC, or SFI chain of custody accreditation, and it must cover the supply base of the client. Chain of custody is the relevant reference because it aligns with the sourcing standard. Now let's move on to the next section. Section 2 covers the certification agreement, specifically what must be included in the contract between the certification body and its clients. The good news here is straightforward. There are no changes in version 2.1. The requirements remain the same as in version 2.0. That said, it's still worth reviewing the standard to make sure your current certification agreements are fully aligned. This is a housekeeping check rather than a transition task. Let's move on to Section 3. Section 3 covers resource requirements. No changes in version 2.1. Briefly, the certification body must have sufficient human and technical resources to manage all certification activities consistently and to prescribed timelines. It must require auditors and technical experts to sign a written agreement committing them to its policies, confidentiality, and impartiality, and to notify the certification body of any prior relationship with an organization they may be assigned to evaluate. It must demonstrate that personnel have the competencies relevant to their assigned activities, application review, auditing, granting of certification, and monitoring of auditors. It must identify training needs and offer training to meet them. And finally, every person involved must clearly understand their duties, responsibilities, and authorities. The photo on this slide is worth pausing on. It shows several stakeholders participating in an audit: the certificate holder, the SBP assurance manager, the certification body auditor, and an assessor from the accreditation body ANAB. Let's move on to Section 4, where we'll look at auditor qualifications in detail. Section 4 covers auditors, their qualifications, training, selection, and performance monitoring. This is one of the more detailed sections, so let's take it step by step. The default rule under Indicator 4.1 hasn't changed. For evaluations against Standards 1 and 2, the auditor must hold an FSC or PEFC-endorsed forest management qualification. For all other SBP standards, a chain of custody qualification is sufficient. What's new in version 2.1 is a carve-out. A chain of custody qualification is now also accepted for Standards 1 and 2 evaluations, provided one of 4 conditions is met. First, the biomass producer sells only SBP-controlled biomass. Second, An EU RED Level A risk assessment has rated all indicators as low risk. Third, an SBP regional risk assessment has rated all indicators as low risk. And fourth, the biomass producer sources only processing residues carrying an FSC or PEFS recognized claim. If any one of those applies, you may deploy a COC qualified auditor. This is an efficiency gain in genuinely low risk contexts. Forest management qualification is no longer required. Version 2.1 also introduces the quality reviewer role. This is the person who independently reviews audit reports and the summary audit report before certification decisions are made. The standard now makes clear that quality reviewers must meet the same education, experience, and training requirements as auditors. In practice, that means your competence tracking systems need to cover quality reviewers as well, not just auditors. A few other points to note. Education and experience requirements themselves are unchanged. For standards 1 and 2, auditors need either a relevant tertiary degree plus 3 years experience or a relevant secondary qualification plus 5 years. For standard 6, at least 2 years experience in biomass or biofuel life cycle assessment is required. Auditors must also be registered in the SBP audit portal, and to maintain their qualification, they must complete at least 3 SBP external audits within the previous 12 months. Let's continue to the next section. Continuing with section 4, the certification body must ensure that auditors and, in version 2.1, quality reviewers as well, successfully complete the initial SBP training course and any additional training required following standard revisions. The certification body's SBP program manager receives regular updates from SBP about the training program and any technical changes, including new normative interpretations, and is expected to pass those updates on to the auditing team. The certification body must have a documented process for selecting, authorizing, and monitoring auditors so that only qualified and competent auditors are deployed. The decision-making function, the person or people who actually grant, refuse, maintain, suspend, or withdraw certification is distinct from the evaluation function and has its own competence requirements. Performance is evaluated on-site at least once every 3 years. The certification body may combine this on-site performance evaluation with a witness audit for another certification scheme, provided the scope is relevant to the auditor's full SBP evaluation authorization. Section 5 covers subcontracting of certification activities to third parties. No changes in version 2.1. The certification body must have a legally enforceable agreement with each body that provides subcontracted services. The agreement must address confidentiality and the identification and avoidance of conflicts of interest. The subcontracted organization may not claim to be accredited, must describe its services as being in association with the certification body, and where possible must link to the certification body's website. Key certification activities may not be subcontracted. Those include policy formulation, process development, initial competence assessment, control of the monitoring process, contract review, and the certification itself. Where the certification body engages individuals or employees from other organizations to provide additional resources or expertise, those individuals do not count as subcontractors, provided they are individually contracted to operate under the CB's management system. Section 6 covers the planning of evaluations. The certification body must provide applicants with all the information they need about the certification process and the SBP certification requirements. When an application is received, the certification body must obtain the information it needs to plan and conduct the evaluation, and it must register the applicant in the audit portal. Version 2.1 adds a new requirement at indicator 6.3, SICIT. Before the evaluation, the certification body must inform the applicant that an SBP certificate can only be issued if the instruction document EU Red is included in the scope of the audit. This is a pre-evaluation communication requirement. Make sure your application correspondence reflects it. The process for selecting and appointing the evaluation team is set out in indicators 6.6 through 6.12. Note that these renumbered from 6.5 through 6.11 in version 2.0. The team must include an evaluation team leader and technical experts as necessary, and the process must follow the relevant requirements of ISO 19011. For version 2.1, the only substantive change here is that the Standard 6 competence clause now references RED 3 rather than READY. The certification body must have documented procedures for determining evaluation time. Factors to consider include the requirements of the relevant SBP standards, the complexity of the client's management system, the technological context, any subcontracting, prior evaluation results, the size and number of sites and their locations, and the risks associated with the client's products, processes, or activities. Travel time between sites is not counted. The duration must be a minimum of 8 hours for a biomass producer and 4 hours for a trader, and any shorter duration for a BP must be justified. Indicator 6.5 is new in version 2.1, and it settles a classification question that has been coming up for years. The rule is simple. Any entity that ultimately consumes SBP certified biomass is classified as an end user. This classification applies regardless of whether Standard 6, energy and carbon balance calculation, is included in the entity scope. If an end user also engages in trade activities, those activities are recorded as secondary. The primary classification remains end user. Why this matters? End users must always be evaluated on site. Remote evaluations are only permitted for certain Standard 4, 5, and 6 evaluations of operations that do not take physical possession of biomass, and end-user evaluations fall outside that permitted scope. In practice, this affects how you register large energy utilities and combined heat and power operators in the audit portal, and how you schedule their recurring evaluations. If you have previously been planning remote surveillance for any end user, you will need to adjust. Sampling. The certification body must have a documented sampling procedure that takes into account intensity, scale, and risk. Logistics sites are considered temporary and do not need to be included in the sample pool. Storage sites are considered permanent and are included in the sample pool unless they have not been used in the year preceding the evaluation. Where the scope includes storage, logistics, or port facilities, the certification body must categorize the sites and justify the sampling methodology in the public summary report. When risk management measures are implemented at the feedstock producing level, in the forest, or at supplier level, the evaluation of those risk management measures must take place at the corresponding level. The default formula for the sample size is unchanged. Y equals 0.8 times the square root of x for initial and re-evaluations, or 0.6 times the square root of x for surveillance evaluations. What changes in version 2.1 is the terminology for X. It is now a supply unit, a forest management unit, a farm, a tough supplier, or similar, rather than sourcing areas or suppliers. And the larger number still prevails when both are applicable. Version 2.1 also adds flexibility. A certification body may develop a sampling methodology that uses an alternative coefficient, provided the alternative is properly justified and documented in the public summary report. The obvious use case is a biomass producer with a very large number of small forest owners, where the default formula would produce a disproportionately large sample. The key discipline here is documentation. If you deviate from the default, your reasoning has to be visible in the PSR. As a worked example, 2 sawmills supply a pellet mill. Each sawmill buys from 100 FMUs. RMMs are implemented at FMU level. The sample is calculated from 200 FMUs, not from 2 sawmills. For an initial evaluation, that means about 12 FMU samples, 0.8 times the square root of 200. Section 7 covers initial and re-evaluation evaluations. When registering a new applicant in the audit portal, the certification body must ask the applicant to disclose whether they are or have been a participant in another certification scheme, or whether they traded under a different legal form or name in the past 12 months. The certification body must then check other scheme certificate lists for the applicant's name or former name. and perform a customer due diligence or know your customer check, particularly for companies with a limited trading history. This was inspired by EU RED requirements and is especially useful in light of recent FSC certificate terminations and blacklistings. Initial evaluations are always conducted on site, even for traders that do not take physical possession of biomass. The certification decision must be made within 12 months of the initial evaluation, otherwise, a full on site re-evaluation is required. The auditor must check the existence and setup of key monitoring systems during the initial evaluation, and in particular the mass balance system. Version 2.1 simplifies the requirement at indicator 7.7 for processing residues and post-consumer feedstock, where version 2.0 listed 4 specific checks: documentation of origin, classification, supplier information, and systems for accuracy and fraud prevention. Version 2.1 replaces that list with a single reference. The auditor checks compliance with Annex 1 of Standard 2. This reduces duplication between the two standards. Version 2.0 changed how certification bodies work with stakeholders, and version 2.1 keeps that approach largely intact. Irrespective of whether the scope includes a supply-based evaluation, for initial and re-evaluations, the certification body must provide SBP at least 1 month before the evaluation, with the name and location of the entity to be assessed, the scheduled evaluation dates, and the contact details for both the certification body and the company, so that stakeholders can submit comments. This is done via the audit portal when registering an applicant. The information must be provided in English and in other relevant languages where appropriate, so that local stakeholders in the supply-based region can meaningfully engage. SBP posts the information on its website. The certification body then reviews any available stakeholder comments for evidence of conformance or potential non-conformance before the evaluation begins. Information gathering also includes the stakeholder engagement plan from the client and any comments actively collected and linked to specific questions or risks in the supply-based evaluation. The results of this information gathering inform the evaluation topics, the evaluation intensity, and the sample of sites. Section 8 covers non-conformances. The certification body records all non-conformances in the evaluation report, identifies and evaluates each one as either minor or major, and ensures that each results in effective corrective action. Major non-conformances must be corrected within 3 months, minor non-conformances within 1 year. Where a major non-conformance cannot be fully corrected within 3 months, sufficient action must be taken within that window to prevent new instances. Timelines start from the date of the certification decision, except for major non-conformances, where the clock starts from the date the major corrective action request is formally communicated in writing no later than 30 days after the closing meeting. One important reminder: the EU RAD bridging document applies its own non-conformance rules that differ from Section 8, and those rules must be followed when auditing the EU RAD part of the scope. This is an important new requirement in version 2.1. Indicator 8.15 sets out for the first time an explicit list of circumstances in which a non-conformance raised against a biomass producer's supply-based evaluation, that is, against Standard 2, must be classified as a major NCR. Until now, the major versus minor distinction was left largely to auditor judgment. Version 2.1 removes that ambiguity for SBE findings by defining 7 specific triggers. Let's walk through them. First, if the biomass producer has no supply-based evaluation process in place at all, that's a major non-conformance. Second, if there is no credible or verifiable evidence of where the feedstock actually comes from, that's also major. Third, if the biomass producer's own risk assessment, the CRA, has not been conducted in line with SBP requirements, that's major. Fourth, if an SBP-endorsed regional risk assessment exists for the area, but the biomass producer hasn't used it, that's a major finding. Fifth, if feedstock is being sourced from areas that were not part of the evaluated supply-based scope, new sourcing areas can only be added through a formal scope change audit. Bringing them in without one is a major NCR. Sixth, if the required control or mitigation measures have not been established or are not being implemented, that's major. And seventh, if information that the standard requires to be made publicly available in the supply base report is missing, that's also a major non-conformance. The practical takeaway for auditors: when you find any of these 7 conditions during an SBE audit, the categorization is no longer a judgment call. Version 2.1 requires it to be raised as a major NCR. Make sure your audit templates and reporting tools reflect this. Let's continue. Section 9 covers reporting requirements. No changes in version 2.1. All SBP public reports must be produced using the audit portal. The closing meeting date must be entered within 5 days of the meeting itself, which allows SBP to monitor audit progress. The public summary report must be completed in the portal within 90 days. The general expectation is that audit portal records stay accurate and up to date. Common issues SBP sees include certification bodies completing an audit without registering it in the audit portal, or a waiver being approved without the audit portal record being updated to reflect it. Please stay on top of both. Let's move on to Section 10, where we do have some changes to cover. Section 10 covers peer review, and the peer review triggers have been meaningfully redefined in version 2.1. A peer review is a review of the certification decision by an independent expert. It takes place after the certification body considers that a positive certification decision is warranted, but before the decision is formally made. It does not replace the CB internal technical review. The two are separate. In version 2.0, peer review was required for any evaluation that included a supply-based evaluation. Version 2.1 replaces that broad trigger with something more surgical. Peer review is now required for 4 specific cases, and only those cases. First, initial and re-evaluations that include a central risk assessment, or EU Red Level B. Second, initial and re-evaluations that include a regional risk assessment with specified risks, or EU RED Level B. Third, any evaluation that adds, as a change of scope, a subscope, a regional risk assessment with specified risks, a central risk assessment, or EU Red Level B. Fourth, any evaluation of a suspended certificate for reinstatement that includes a central risk assessment or a regional risk assessment with specified risks, or EU Red Level B. Note what this means for the low-risk case. If a biomass producer's supply base is covered by a regional risk assessment in which all indicators are rated low risk, peer review is no longer automatically triggered. The same is true if no central risk assessment, no specified risk RRA, and no EU Red Level B is in scope. This aligns with the version 2.1 relaxation we saw for auditor qualification in indicator 4.1. They are part of the same family of changes, prorate the oversight to the actual risk. Operationally, the peer reviewer must be selected from SBP's approved list, which is maintained on the SBP website. The peer reviewer must not have been contracted by the certification body during the previous 2 years and must not have worked with the specific company being evaluated as a consultant or employee. The peer reviewer reviews the draft public summary report and the supply-based report if necessary, and may comment on any aspect of the certification decision process. The peer review process is integrated into the audit portal, where a short checklist documents the review and any remarks together with the certification body's responses. Section 11 covers the certification decision. The certification body retains authority and responsibility for all certification decisions. If a subcontractor is used elsewhere in the certification process, the decision function itself stays with the CB. The certification body assigns a decision-making entity that is separate from the evaluation team. That entity must meet requirements for qualification, experience, and impartiality. It must not include individuals with conflicts of interest, financial or commercial, and it must not include the evaluation team leader, the auditors, or the technical experts who conducted the evaluation. The decision is based on the evidence in the evaluation report, the corrective actions taken in response to any non-conformances, the conclusions of the peer review where applicable, and any other relevant evaluation information. Indicator 11.6 is the one change in this section. The certification body shall make the certification decision within 3 months of the closing meeting, not 1 month as version 2.0 required. The new window aligns with the 90-day public summary report timeline and removes a scheduling pinch that CBs had been managing by issuing conditional decisions. Note the wording. It is a shall requirement, not a shall. Finally, the certification body communicates the decision to the client after the evaluation. Section 12 covers the requirements for SBP certificates themselves. Most of this is technical. The formal certification documentation must identify the SBP logo, the name and address of the certification body, the CB certificate number, the name and address of the certified organization, the full name and version of the SBP standards evaluated, the certification scope including any standards that are not in scope, the SBP certificate number in the format SBPXXYY, the certificate version, the issue and expiry dates, and the CB signature. Formal certification documentation is only issued after 3 conditions are met. The decision to grant or extend the scope of certification has been made, all certification requirements have been fulfilled, and the client agreement has been completed and signed. One structural change in version 2.1, indicator 12.12, the 5-year cap on certificate validity, has been moved from Annex 1 into Section 12. The substance is unchanged. Version 2.1 also adds an entirely new indicator, 12.13, which creates a narrow safety valve on that 5-year cap. We'll cover that on the next slide. Indicator 12.13 is new in version 2.1. It introduces a narrow safety valve. If circumstances outside both the certification bodies and the certificate holder's control prevent a re-evaluation being completed before the certificate's expiry date, the certification body may request an extension of the certificate validity by up to 6 months. The process is 3 steps. First, the certification body records the circumstances. Second, it informs the SBP Secretariat, providing the rationale for requesting an extension and a proposed new validity date no more than 6 months beyond the original expiry. Third, it awaits SBP's review. If SBP approves the request, SBP updates the audit portal entry. The standard explicitly states that each extension is considered on a case-by-case basis, and none is taken as forming any precedent. 2 things to emphasize. First, this is genuinely for circumstances beyond control, natural disasters, client-side emergencies, travel restrictions. It is not a workaround for routine scheduling difficulties. Second, the certification body must satisfy itself that the client will maintain conformance with SBP requirements until the new expiry date. Think of this as a last resort, not a planning tool. Let's move on to Section 13. Section 13 covers the general requirements for surveillance evaluations. A surveillance evaluation is a periodic review that monitors the certificate holder's continued conformance with the applicable SBP standards. The on-site element must be completed before the end of the anniversary month of the initial evaluation closing meeting. So, if the initial closing meeting was in January, the first surveillance must be completed by the end of the following January. Certification bodies may request an alternative anniversary month from SBP where it helps with efficient scheduling. At least 4 on-site surveillances must take place before the certificate expires. The surveillance procedure must address continued conformance with all conditions and corrective actions, a review of any complaints or allegations of non-conformance, and an evaluation of an adequate and appropriate sample of sites, records, and stakeholder interviews to verify that management systems are working effectively. Remote evaluations may be carried out without the need for on-site visits for operations that do not take physical possession of SBP-certified feedstock or biomass in their own or rented facilities, and do not label, alter, store, or repackage the products. G. Sales offices or agents. Remote evaluations are only applicable for standards 4, 5, and 6. They are never applicable for standards 1 and 2, and as we saw earlier, they are never applicable to end users. Finally, the certification body may waive a surveillance evaluation if no biomass has been produced, labeled, or sold with an SBP claim since the last evaluation. A signed declaration from the client is required, together with the commitment to contact the certification body before production or sale resumes, and to maintain the chain of custody system in the meantime. No more than 2 consecutive surveillance evaluations may be waived. The content of a surveillance evaluation depends on which standards are in the certificate scope. For standards 1 and 2, the surveillance reviews changes to the supply base evaluation, the client's operational plans for the next 12 months, feedstock supply records, records of the risk assessment and the monitoring carried out, and records of any risk management measures with their subsequent monitoring. For standards 4, 5, and 6, the surveillance additionally reviews any changes to the scope and to the chain of custody procedures. Inventory records, input and output documentation, including invoices and bills and transport documents, mass balance calculations for each product group, a sample of records tracing outputs back to inputs to verify reconciliation, how data is entered into the data transfer system, the accuracy of the SBP SAR report, and any greenhouse gas calculations where applicable. That covers the content of surveillance evaluations. Next, we'll turn to the final sections of the standard. The remaining sections are sections 14 and 15 and Annex 1. Section 14 covers termination, scope revision, suspension, and withdrawal. Any such decision must be taken by one or more persons who were independent of the evaluation. The certification body must notify SBP in writing within 3 business days, stating the action taken, the effective date, and the reason. The client must immediately cease making SBP claims. Suspensions may not exceed 12 months. Beyond that, the certification body must terminate the certificate. Section 15 covers complaints and appeals. The certification body must acknowledge receipt, include the SBP Secretariat in correspondence, provide an initial response within 2 weeks, and resolve the complaint or appeal within 3 months. Complaints are only accepted where they relate directly to non-conformance with SBP requirements. Annex 1 covers the process for transferring certificates between certification bodies. We won't go into the detail here. The Annex is self-contained, and the DTS handles most of the administrative follow-on. Version 2.1 adds one new indicator to Section 14.5, which deserves its own slide, and that's what comes next. Indicator 14.5 is new in version 2.1, and it links 2 things that were previously independent. If SBP suspends or terminates a certificate holder's trademark license agreement, the certification body must suspend or terminate the corresponding SBP certificate. Previously, the trademark license agreement, which governs the client's right to use the SBP trademarks, could be suspended by SBP for reasons such as non-payment of fees or misuse of the marks, while the underlying certificate continued to show as active. Version 2.1 closes that gap. The 2 statuses must now move together. The practical implication for certification bodies is a monitoring obligation. You need a process to receive, log, and act on SBP notifications about TMLA changes. When SBP notifies you that a client's TMLA has been suspended or terminated, you act on the corresponding SBP certificate, following your normal suspension or termination procedures, including the 3 business day notification back to SBP that applies to any suspension or termination. That completes our walkthrough of Standard 3, version 2.1. That's the end of the module on Standard 3. I hope it has given you a clear view of what's in version 2.1 and, more importantly, where it differs from version 2.0 in ways that will affect your day-to-day work. For the full standard, associated FAQs, and the current list of approved peer reviewers, please visit our website. Questions and clarification requests can be sent to us via email. The SBP team is always open to receive them. Thank you for your attention.